Welcome everybody to our next installment of our Winter-Spring webinar series. My name is Matt Eby. I'm a Regional Manager of Support Services, and I'm joining you here from Christchurch, which it definitely feels like winter today, okay? So staying nice and cozy in the office, but we're just really pleased to put this out, and we have a few joining us just from their living rooms, patients, families, and some LBC staff here to tune in for a session on grief and loss. So before I turn things over we're joined by Erica Weerekoon. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an intro about Erica. Now she's in the past has a background with a Master's of Counseling, as well as a BA in Nursing and Anthropology, and a Master in Health Personnel Education. As well, she's registered with the New Zealand Association of Counsellors. So she's actually a qualified counselor working in the areas of change, loss, and grief. And she's committed to supporting others through times of great stress in their lives. She has worked throughout her career in areas of ill health, hospice, and palliative care. Firstly, as a registered nurse, she trained at the Waikato Hospital, and later in palliative care education in Sydney and for New South Wales Cancer Society, and for the last 25 years as a counsellor in Sri Lanka and in Hamilton, New Zealand. During the 12 years Erica lived with her husband and family in Sri Lanka, she worked voluntarily as an educator and counselor with the Sri Lanka Cancer Society. She also founded the Cancer Care Service in Kandy, an NGO care for people living with mouth cancer and their families. In her work, Erica's special interest is supporting people coping with loss and change, encouraging self-care and interconnectedness we have with each other and with nature. And one last thing, you talk to her, she says, to nourish her mind, body, and spirit, Erica enjoys down-to-earth mindfulness practice, restoring their gully, and planting native trees on her family property at Te Pahu. So with that, I do want to turn it over to Erica in just one moment, but I'll just make a mention, this has been with all of our webinar series. If you are joining us here and a question comes to your mind, simply go to your bottom of your screen, and there's like a Q&A in the middle of the panel, and you can just start typing in a question. When she finishes her slides, we'll get a chance to answer some questions. So with that, very excited to hand it over to Erica. Thank you. Over to you, Erica.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Matt. That's just wonderful and very full introduction. So thank you so much. Yes, today I do want to offer to you a whole combination of learnings of mine over all these years of my career and my life now. But in this area of grief and loss, and make it very broad, because grief and loss affect us all throughout life, not just in death. So it's going to be a very broad offering today. And I'd like to start out by acknowledging that each one of us in living our lives is touched by loss and experiences grief. And whatever it is that touches us remains with us and shapes us. And right at the starting moment, I'd love to acknowledge from where I've come and my background and my ancestry and my parents and my family and the learnings that I've had through all that has touched me throughout my upbringing, but also through my career with working with patients, with working with clients, with working with colleagues, with going to university. There's so much that we learn along the way, and today is a combination of a whole lot of my learnings. So it's a very broad offering, and I hope you enjoy and maybe take something away from what I put up today. I've got about 40 slides, so it's quite a big presentation. But there are pictures virtually with every slide, and I'd just love you to take whatever meanings and hopefulness from whatever I show today, whether it's from the pictures or whether it's from the words. This lovely tui is sitting in a gorgeous cherry tree out at my mother's farm, and I took this photograph last spring, but it's really in honour of my mother and the fact that she died 6 years ago. She herself had a blood cancer, but in the end she probably died from her dementia. And yet I honour her in every tui I see and hear. I have a link to my mother. Today I'm going to cover quite a lot, as I said, and we're going to look at understandings of loss and grief. I'm going to share with you some of my academic learnings that have guided me in the way I support people who are coping with change and coping with loss in their life. And there'll be lots of words and ideas that you would have come across yourselves in your own lives without any university background, but just words that come up in our society for how, and certainly in our Western society, for how we describe loss and grief. I want to also just comment a little bit about loss and grief and cancer illness, but acknowledging that each one of you will be experiencing your own types of loss and grief in relation to cancer illness, either with yourself or with family members. And then towards the end of my slides, I'm going to highlight something of just ways that we can employ to grieve healthily and to make sure that as we run out of energy, we keep replenishing our resilience. So to begin with, what is loss? Loss can be obvious or a little more hidden, but it comes in many, many forms, and it comes throughout life. It may be from death, disease, disability, disaster, and I think of just disasters that have happened in our own country in recent times, the losses associated with those disasters, with accidents, with theft, with destruction of one's home, and you know, my mind goes immediately to the people of the Lake Ohau area and the destruction of their property through fire, through loss of career, and certainly reminders for all of us with COVID and job losses. But also loss in relation to our relationships and perhaps dissolution of marriages or friendships and other intimate relationships. So loss is part of life. It's an effect that is there with change. It's not the only effect with change, because of course there are amazing gains with change. There's potential for amazing gains with change as well, but loss is an effect of change. And it could be a changed world and our own personal world, just from moving house or moving country, but also how our world has changed with COVID, with climate change, and through war. And then change in roles and what comes about with loss of our identity or loss of confidence, with financial loss or the loss of routine, even just the simple loss of going to work each day if we lose our jobs. And a changed reality is another way of looking at change, that opportunities could be lost, or our safety, our sense of safety, our sense of freedom, loss of independence, loss of hope, loss of dreams. So loss is complex and varied and big. I pay tribute to Mike King here with this slide. Back in 2017, he coined the phrase, take a minute and change a life. And it was in relation to the loss of life through suicide. But his highlight is to say that if we take a minute to stop and ask someone else to share with us how they are, what's their story, what are they going through on their life's journey, that in taking that moment to check in with them, we may change their life. This year's World Suicide Prevention Day was on September the 10th, And the theme was, it's okay to talk. A continuing encouragement that it's okay to talk about how we are and what's happening to us in life, about what struggles we are facing and what gives us strength to face those struggles. Today itself, Friday the 16th of October, speak up, stand together and stop bullying. This is really targeting the change and the loss that comes about through bullying at school. And whether it's the perpetrator of the bullying or the people on the receiving end of the bullying, it is an immense time of change and turmoil and loss. And for us to have the courage to speak up and stand together, we can help to stop this bullying. So the links with grief in relation to loss. Grief is our reaction to loss. It's a common human experience. It affects us all. It's normal to feel grief, especially when we lose something or someone. And that something or someone has a value to us. It's important to us. How do you understand grief? Grief is not something that is easy to talk about. The whole area of loss can be an awkward moment, acknowledging, speaking, asking. It can be awkward. So what is it that you understand about grief? Is it a specific emotion or is it more than an emotion? Is grief universal or is it different to each person? Are there stages of grief? You may have heard about things like this. And do most people resolve their grief? Or if they do, or if they don't, what's the time frame? So some short answers to these questions. Grief affects every part of us. It's not just an emotion. It affects our thoughts, our feelings, our body, our spirit, our relationships. The way we grieve is not universal. Our grieving is absolutely individual, just like our fingerprint. It's different for every person. There are no predictable stages, and there's no timetable. Grief takes the time it takes. So, how do we cope? How do we react? How do we manage our grief? And there are so many different variables that can affect the grief that we are experiencing. The causes of our grief makes our grief different. The circumstances of the loss or the death and the significance of that loss to us. Not everything is super important, but certainly some things are. Our age and stage in life, our personality, our coping style, our life experiences, our physical and mental health, our faith, our beliefs, our culture, our families, our communities, our rituals, our traditions. All these things are so variable. There's no specific prescription for how grief affects us. There's no specific prescription for how we do our grieving. It depends. So I'm going to share with you some of the models that I've picked up in all of my training around loss and grief, because as we've gone through our decades over time, learnings and understandings change and are built on, and what might have been helpful at the beginning might not be so helpful today, but it all influences us. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is someone who in the 60s came up with the 5 stages of grief, And these emotions and behaviours are certainly not wrong. But what she put out as a stages of grief model is something that we know now doesn't happen in this order. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance may be things that we experience, but they may not be. We might experience some, but not all. And more latterly, David Kessler added a sixth stage of grief called finding meaning. William Werden in the 1980s, he came up with 4 tasks of mourning, and his emphasis was that we needed to work on our grief. In order to get over our grief, we needed to accept the reality of the loss. We needed to face the pain and experience the pain of grief, that we needed to adjust to the environment with the person no longer being there, and that we needed to withdraw our emotional energy from the relationship with that person and reinvest in another. Helpful things at some points and helpful things to reflect on, but may not suit everybody. In the 90s, these Dutch researchers, Margaret Strebe and Henk Schutt, came up with the dual process model of grieving. And that's an interesting model that looks at grief as a process, an ongoing, flexible process, not something that you go through stages or you work on tasks and then it's done. This is an ongoing, flexible process in which we oscillate backwards and forwards. Sometimes we are orientated to the loss. We're absorbed in our grief. We're overcome by our grief. And other times, we are focusing on picking up our life. We're focusing on managing and coping and finding relief from our grief. And both of these orientations, whichever side we go to, are regarded as actually normal and healthy, and that this oscillation helps us to adjust. Even more recent theory is from Robert Niemeyer, and his theory is one that talks about meaning reconstruction, and that our world is forever changed by the loss of whatever it is we're experiencing. And this is our personal world. But it's not just a personal experience that loss and grief gives us. It happens as a social event. It's within a point in history. It's within a cultural situation. It's within a family context. And all these things have meaning. This picture that I put up shows a notice written in the Sinhala language across the street in Sri Lanka, indicating that a death has occurred and giving notice of where the family live, and that you can go to that house and pay your respects if you follow the white flags. White is the colour of bereavement in Sri Lanka, and that shows a cultural difference immediately, because generally our cultural colour for death in Western terms is black, although there is change and a lot of people love to bring colour into their grief and their bereavement journeys. But sometimes culturally, societies sanction a certain culture, and certainly it is different from one culture to another. But this model of grief validates the meaning in any unique personal, community, social setting, and it's validated through storytelling. And storytelling can come in many forms. And the purpose of the storytelling is to connect the living with whoever we have lost, whoever has died. That we can do this connection through letter writing, through shrine making, through sculptures, creative works, maybe digital storytelling, photography projects, even remembering and reflecting and remaking our connections through storytelling. This is a lovely example of that. It's come out recently here in New Zealand. It's a book written by 100 different women who have had breast cancer surgery. Now, this month is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and the Breast Cancer Foundation of New Zealand is asking us to take a stand against breast cancer and show our support for the loss that's experienced by women and by families through the impact of breast cancer. This book, Dear Boobs, is an accumulation of letters written by women, letters to their breasts as they were planning or on the aftermath of breast surgery. Another model which is very helpful in today's society is this idea of continuing bonds, that for people who don't want to get over and find closure and a finiteness to grieving, that sometimes we want to maintain our connectedness through various different forms. And this beautiful picture of a fantail reminds me of a young mother who told her children that whenever they saw a fantail, after she had gone, and she died from cancer, a blood cancer, that whenever they saw this fantail, any fantail, it would remind them of her. The words that I've got on this slide come from a poem from a bereaved mother to her child. And she wrote, "Will you forgive me if I go on? If you can't make this earthly journey with me, will you then come along in my heart and wish me well?" And these pictures on this slide where we story our positioning after death through various ways. Some people talk about seeing a shooting star or the bright star in the sky. Just last night, we were remembering a loss of a wee one in our own family, but it connected us through candle lighting, because this week, in fact, and last night, there's an international pregnancy and infant loss remembrance going on throughout the world. And we all lit candles last night just to connect us to the life that has been gone, that has been lost through pregnancy, through death. But we don't forget. We honour that life. Lois Tonkin, who herself had a life-limiting illness and died last year, a Christchurch grief counsellor, came up with her own model of grief because she worked particularly with women who were circumstantially childless. And what she talks about is how grief totally absorbs our world for a while, but over time we build our lives around the loss. The loss is always present, but we grow around it and carry on. There are terms and definitions that many of you will have heard that I'd like to just clarify a little bit, because these bring different types of grief. But a loss that is associated, it hasn't happened just yet, but it's going to happen in the future, brings anticipatory grief. Ambiguous loss is something that is a loss that is unclear, and I'm thinking of the young men who are perhaps lost at sea after the boat went down with all the animals on it recently. We don't know whether those people are alive or not alive. People who are lost, missing, presumed dead, but who knows? And certainly experience of people presumed dead in war who have turned up, knocking on the doors of their family. So it's a very difficult, stressful kind of loss to go through because it is unclear. Dementia brings another unclear loss. The person is still with us, but they're not the same. Sometimes they don't recognise us, and we can't have a conversation with them as they were. And so there's immense loss in the relationship, and yet the person hasn't died yet. and infertility, where it's unclear as to whether someone can ever have a child, and they try, and yet there is immense loss of the realization that actually there is infertility. Cumulative loss is another term that some of you may have heard about, and certainly in our world today with COVID, the experience of cumulative loss is very real, that we are experiencing multiple losses, and with each loss there is grief. And if we don't manage to cope with our grieving, having multiple loss occur one upon the other can increase our risk of maybe really struggling and maybe even becoming depressed. Disenfranchised grief. Gosh, these terms are incredible, aren't they? But it just shows us that grief is such a complicated subject, that there is grief for people that may not be openly acknowledged. I recently had a young woman talk to me about how her workplace wouldn't give her time off. She was grieving the loss of her neighbour, and no one understood how significant the neighbour was in her family. This neighbour was a surrogate grandfather to her young son, because her own father had died, and this neighbour became really important in their family. But in our world of having so many days off work for significant loss, it didn't work. And she was really wanting to be acknowledged that her grief was real. Prolonged grief disorder is another complicated grief that is recognised by the World Health Organization, and it just describes a persistent, pervasive preoccupation with the deceased, leading to significant impairment for functioning in life. And it really needs the healthcare team to come in and work with that person if that is what's happened in their life. However, this lovely slide by Rabbi Earl Groman, I think, sums up all these models and definitions in a beautiful way. Grief is not a disorder, it's not a disease, and it's not a sign of weakness. It's an emotional and physical and spiritual necessity. It's the price you pay for love. And the only cure for grief is to grieve. Beautiful. So I'd like to take our attention to cancer illness at this point in my talk, because this is something that will be right there with all of you, and cancer illness can bring about absolutely unexpected grieving, because it can take us places that we never thought we'd go. I've just put this slide together just to highlight that grief is a very understandable part of the cancer illness journey. It's not an exclusive list, but getting the diagnosis, fears around treatment, the uncertainty of what lies ahead, having severe pain, losing one's independence, fear of treatment not working, fear of the cancer returning, the prospect of losing someone you love. All of these are real aspects of loss in cancer illness, and each one of us will grieve these losses in our own unique way. So what may be your experience? The next two slides, this one and the next one, are really full slides. You might experience anything that comes up on these slides. You don't necessarily experience it all, but you certainly may have distressing emotions. Or on the other side of the slide, your body may react in different ways. You might not sleep. You might have lots of different aches and pains. You might have panic attacks. In our emotional sense of vulnerability, we might feel extreme sadness. We might feel absolutely overwhelmed and out of control. We might feel nothing at times. I'm not saying that all of these things you need to feel. It's just that these are possibilities and they are common. There may be things that we think that could be helpful that may not be helpful. But again, these are common ways of thinking when we are experiencing cancer or when someone in our family has cancer. If I ignore it, it'll go away. Or no, this definitely can't be happening to me. I had a woman recently who absolutely refused to accept that she had cancer, and she just said, nobody has cancer in my family. This can't be so. I can't have it. I'm well. And she did have it. And eventually she faced it. We may behave in ways that are totally out of character for us. We might totally withdraw. We might feel absolutely confused and not know where to go, what to do, how to concentrate. And we might start dreaming. So I'm not saying that you will experience all of these things, but any of these things are possibilities and they are common and understandable. However, as Helen Keller says, although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming of it. And we all have ability to overcome difficulty. Again, a beautiful tui, this time in the kowai tree in my own garden. A very inquiring look on that tui, I must say. So what helps us in our efforts to adapt to our losses and to find a healthy way of grieving? A stunning picture taken while I was in Sri Lanka last year. But I put this up because it reminds me of ways of being together that can be helpful. And in my words on this slide, they're words from Catherine Gallagher from Australia. She did a whole study into factors that help people with blood cancers in their way of coping and surviving. These are the factors that she came up with that positively help. To be active in our way of coping, to reframe things in a positive way, to have the support of our families, to have the support of good friends, and to maintain exercise. These 5 things, she said, are really, really helpful. She also put something that was not helpful, and for us to remember to not be our own worst critic, but self-blame is something that actually lowers our resilience. So what constitutes meaningful support for you? What can you do that can meaningfully support yourself? What might others offer you that might help you in your grief? And what might you offer to other people who may be coping with their grief? I'm wondering how many of you might have read David Down's book. It is amazing. It's not for everyone, and he admits that it's not for everyone, but oh my goodness, he uses humour as a way of supporting himself and his family on his journey in coping with a blood cancer. But one of the things he came up with, which I thought was really just lovely to bring up here, is that, and I'll read it out to you because it's a classic. People are dead set on asking me probing questions and on offering me advice. How are you bearing up? How are you holding together? Now don't forget to breathe. Keep your chin up. It's like everyone is interested in my posture all of a sudden, as if there's been an influx of Alexander Technique consultants. It's tough to live up to this encouragement too. I can only keep my chin up so far before I start looking like I'm trying to see through my nostrils. Oh, well, his sense of humour has really helped him, and he offers it to others. It's a delightful book if you've got the opportunity to read it. Our ABCs is a place to start. What might help? Starting at the beginning. Acknowledge adversity. Recognise our assumptions. Get the facts. Ask the clinical team. Don't feel we have to do it on our own. The B stands for be aware. Be aware of how your body feels, be aware of what your thoughts are, be aware of your own feelings, your feelings of vulnerability. It's only once you're aware that you can make some choices around this. Be open to the moment, to this moment. You're breathing. You're alive today. There is a certainty of change, but be open to now. Be optimistic. Breathe. C stands for choose wisely. Choose your fights. Choose to connect in meaningful ways. And it's up to you as to what's meaningful to you. It's a personal thing. Choose your support people. Not everybody can be in that category of a meaningful support person. Sometimes we need to leave people aside because they may not be the wisest people to have around us. And prioritise your self-care. How the hell do you do this? How do we prioritise self-care? What might care for you look like? Maybe it's just taking one step at a time. Maybe it's pausing, stopping. Maybe it's breathing out slowly because it's really tough what you're going through. At the beginning of October, Tara Connell gave you all a wonderful presentation, and she really highlighted noticing the good. What a wonderful strategy, a coping mechanism to help you care for yourself. Learn to notice what's good. Sometimes crying helps. Keeping a journal. We easily forget where we've come, what we've been through, and sometimes just expressing it on paper means that the strength of the paper holds what we're feeling rather than keeping it all in our heads and in our hearts. Maybe some people might like meditation. Some people might like prayer as a way of caring for themselves. Sometimes walking together or walking alone in nature. Megan Devine says that regardless of whatever happens and how much effort we put into caring for ourselves, sometimes we just don't feel okay. And you know what? It's okay that you're not okay. She's written a wonderful book. It's a great guide if you're really looking for support in how to look after yourself. These are some of the things that she says. Acknowledgement is one of the few things that helps. Be active in finding ways to live with your loss. Grief doesn't need correcting, it just needs companionship. Many times things are way beyond our control. It's not our fault, it's not our doing. But what is in our control is how we care for ourselves. We all need a break at times. So what does a healthy break from grief look like? Yep, it might mean chocolate. It might. But there are lots of other things that can give us a healthy break from grief. Music, an interesting podcast can take us places. Phoning a friend, walking the dog, reading, blobbing out with Netflix repeatedly, planting trees, cleaning the car, cleaning the windows, sorting the linen cupboard, going to the movies. Oh, if we had the strength, cooking or baking, going to work sometimes at various points in our journey, knitting, sewing, building a planter box, meeting friends, talking and laughing. Yep, laughing is okay. It gives us a break from grieving. This gorgeous book by Heather Stang, for anyone who's interested in mindfulness, does give some lovely guidance for meditations that can help us to find calm and to restore our spirit. It focuses on attending to our grief with love and with kindness. The desire to be safe, to be happy, and to be free of suffering is absolutely with us all. We all want to be safe. We all want to be happy. We all want to be free from suffering. And here she offers some guided ways to do that. Oh, Pooh offers us amazing advice. A friend is someone who helps you when you're down, and if they can't help you to come up, they lay right down beside you and listen. So reaching out to others can help us in our hopefulness that we're not alone, that together we can get through this. Talking to family, talking with a friend, joining a support group, getting back in touch with your interest group, sometimes online connections. David Downs talked about the helpfulness of the CAR T cell, CAR T therapy support group and how fabulous he found that. Attend memorial services. These really help sometimes when we're reaching out to each other and in community. Talking with a counsellor can be helpful for some people, and seeing your GP, certainly. Just before I finish, I want to just make a comment about unhealthy coping behaviours, because if we are experiencing any of these, or we know someone close to us who is, these experiences really need the team, the healthcare team support, because these coping behaviours are unhealthy. If we use work as an escape, or if we take excessive time off work to escape from our grief, if we use sleep, constantly sleeping in order to not face our own pain and the world, and if we constantly watch TV or constantly game as a distraction from what we're going through, this is constant, persistent, pervasive expression that interrupts healthy functioning. Some of this, some of the time, is fine, but excessively it is unhealthy. Using alcohol, drugs, compulsive sexual behaviour, overspending, these are forms of escapism that are unhealthy. Unhealthy denial, there is healthy denial, but there is unhealthy denial, which is extreme, and people who are trying to erase the memory of someone they've loved, erase that permanently, very unhealthy. Our anger reactions that actually end up hurting people physically or emotionally. Anger is a very normal, natural, acceptable emotion, but our expression of it needs to be safe and healthy. So these other ways are unhealthy. And having intention and feelings of ending our own lives, also unhealthy. We need support. Grieving takes the time it takes. A beautiful picture I took while I was sitting in the sea on the east coast of Sri Lanka. Oh, gorgeous moment. But how we live the time we have whatever time it takes, whatever time is with us, whatever time of day it is, we have choice. And Jay Shetty, who you might have heard of just recently, has given some lovely talks on national radio and been interviewed on TV. He comes up with the acronym TIME, T-I-M-E, and he says these things can be so helpful in living meaningfully each moment. Be thankful. Look for inspiration. Meditate and exercise. Some of these things I've repeated throughout other people's advice, but he puts it in a succinct way. Just be in the moment. You have this moment in time. Our own Dr. Lucy Hone, who lectures at the University of Auckland and is a psychologist, has put out this amazing book on resilient grieving. And for all the guidance I've offered you today, she adds to this by saying there are no rules. You have to work out what you need and tell others what you need. Be realistically optimistic. Share good moments with friends. Speak openly. Tell your story. Reminisce. And allow others to talk about what they're feeling and their loss, their grief. Exercise is medicine, she reinforces that. And one of her lovely practices that she herself used in following the death of her daughter in coping with her grief was tidying the teaspoons in the drawer. I've just put this up at the end as additional resources that any of you might like to refer back to, but they are fabulous resources, both available locally, and a couple of them I've just made reference to Australia because I belong to the Centre for Grief and Bereavement in Melbourne, and I use a lot of their resources. But we have our own fabulous resources here through Skylight, through the Grief Centre in Auckland, and through a lot of our online resources, through SANS. Don't hesitate to look for other resources and reach out at any point that you need to. I'm very happy to share these slides. I'm very happy if anybody wants additional identification of where I found these resources or referencing to some of the work. Please be in touch with me, send me an email or contact Matt. I'm very happy to support anyone in any way that is practical, and I wish you all well in your life. I wish you well in coping with whatever comes along. I wish you safety and a time of being as healthy as possible and a life that's lived with ease. I'm very happy to answer any questions, and thank you all for listening.
Erica, thank you. That was a wonderful presentation and great insights and even some good practical tips in there. So yeah, really appreciate that. Well spoken. I'm just going to look on there's a few questions, so we've got a little bit of time. We'll take a look at these questions. I'll just try to read out from the top here. The first one, you might be looking at it. What advice would you give or would you have as the best way to work through complicated grief?
Thank you for that question. I think there's no one simple answer to that question. Someone called Catherine Shear, who works at the Complicated Grief Centre in Atlanta in America, she does a lot of work around complicated grief, and one of the things that she says is that all grief is complicated. And one of the ways to attend or to help us through our complicated grief is to reach out. That doing our grief alone cannot be the easiest way to work through our grief. Complicated grief is a personal thing, so it requires the telling of a story. What is your experience? And so the answer to what's the best way to do that is only when I hear the story of what is happening in your life. What makes it feel so complicated? What is the complexity of it? And then we can work out ways to work through that. If you'd like more on this, I'm happy to follow up individually. And Matt, I'd leave it over to you if this particular person wants any further contact.
Okay, yep, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. The next was a question about the slides, and thank you. You were so willing to share your slides, so yep, appreciate that. Another one is someone from Anonymous that, 3 months post-treatment, I still feel full of grief for the person I used to be before treatment.
Yeah.
I'm resentful I'm not able to be that person again.
Yeah.
Any tips on how I can move forward from this?
Wow. Wow, what an amazing feeling that's just full for you at the moment. And 3 months post-treatment is very recent, but it must feel like forever. And you must wish that you could just go back to being normal. Being normal. What is normal? Wishing for what we were before is kind of an unreal wish. Being able to look at who we are now can be a way to help us to move forward. And who we are now, who you are at this moment, is someone who's holding resentment. And why not? But how is this resentment, how is this feeling affecting you? How is it sitting, where is it sitting in your body? And sometimes when I referred earlier in my slides about begin with your ABCs, just acknowledge that resentment is a very natural, understandable emotion to have. Acknowledgement is the way to start. Don't chastise yourself. Don't feel annoyed with yourself that you feel this resentment. It's real. It's part of you. You won't always be like this. You will find a way forward. And some of the things that help us to move forward is to have a look at who am I today? How am I coping today? I was what I was back then. Today, I'm a different person. Who am I today? How would I like to cope today? How would I like to enjoy this day? It's a beautiful sunny sky here in Hamilton. It's still cold. But can I actually enjoy just a moment of the beauty of this day and then go back to feeling resentment? The more little moments of taking a break from our feelings that are overwhelming, a little moment of taking a break can help us to move forward. I hope that helps. And again, I'm happy to work with whoever you are. If you'd like to pursue this through Matt and have more conversations with me, I'm happy about that too.
Yeah, really appreciate your response. This other one is just asking about a recording, and yes, to you, Virginia. Yep, we'll have this recorded and up on our LBC YouTube link within the next day or so. Another one, Erica, this is thanking you for a thoughtful presentation. And is there any book that you would recommend for someone who is newly bereaved?
Beautiful question, and a lovely heartfelt thought to support someone else who's grieving. I think I'd probably start by asking the person whether they feel like reading something. Because when we are newly bereaved, sometimes we can't concentrate at all. And sometimes we don't even want to read. Even reading the newspaper is all too much. So if the person is open to reading something, there is the book that I've mentioned in the talk, the book about it's okay to be not okay. That is certainly a very comforting book to read, because it says things like what you need in your grief is support and companionship. You don't need fixing. And even to pick up that book and just read one of the quotes in it might be enough. And then put it down, because when you're newly bereaved, you might not be able to cope with more than that. But then you've got the book and you can pick it up later when you want to have another look for something else that might be inspiring. So perhaps that book would be a lovely one. There's also a special reference that I came across called 10 Tips for Healthy Grieving. And Matt, I would need to send that to you. It's an article that I've got, and I'm very happy to do that. And you might be able to send that on if this person gets in touch with you. It's a much shorter article, but it's also a really good one, because it talks about the intensity of early grief, which is quite different from our feelings of grief further down the track.
Okay, thank you for that. That's really good to know. Yeah, I'm happy to take any link from you. Yeah, for that book you're referring to. Hey, now here's a few. I have a couple questions from anonymous patients or caregivers. The one is to do with Erica, anticipatory grief. So thinking about a caregiver who, you know, their loved one is palliated, and you know, and so they're thinking about the future with their partner. They'll lose their partner. And is there any other tips in that anticipatory grief space? You know, how they should sort of go about things, or yeah, sort of the question.
Yeah, beautiful question. And anticipated grief can be a tricky one to work out, because when we're anticipating that we're going to lose someone who we really love, sometimes there are losses already that we are experiencing, and those losses are different because they're already with us. So those losses are current grief. Anticipatory grief is the possibility of what might come and be with us in the future. And it's helpful when we are anticipating a loss in the future to start out by asking ourselves, what have we lost already? And how are we managing this? Then if we're really focusing on what's about to come, my advice would be self-care. Look after yourself and start with your body, which means eating well, exercising, getting sleep, expressing how you feel, sharing with someone else. You know, really look after your body, because what's ahead is difficult. And the more healthy your body is, the more able you are to cope with the draining of energy that comes as grief keeps coming, and the grief that's going to be there in the future. You're going to need energy for it. I hope that helps.
Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah, thank you for answering that. I do have another one. I'm thinking a caregiver, and they just recall, this sounds like it happens ongoing. The question, is it considered healthy grieving? So they report, they'll have like a sob session. It might go on for 10 to 20 minutes or so, maybe a time or two a day, or, you know, regular. And, but then they just get on with their life, you know, they get on with their day. Is that sort of considered healthy grieving, is what they're asking?
Absolutely. Beautiful description of the normal things, the common things. And even the link to one of those slides that I put up about the dual process model of grieving, how at times we're really absorbed and taken over by our feelings of loss, and we might cry, or we might just want to be shut away. And within the same day, we can move into getting on with our life and coping. And it is regarded as very healthy, because to be crying all day is way too hard. To cry for 10 or 20 minutes, as you describe, is a very healthy way of releasing how you feel, releasing the pressure in your body, releasing the feelings in your heart, and then being able to carry on functioning and carry on with your day. Beautifully healthy. Thank you for that.
Okay, yeah, appreciate it. Hey, might just do one last, because yeah, with time, just make it, if that's okay. This is, well, it could be a patient or caregiver, but, and maybe it's just more you commenting on it. There was a slide in your presentation where there's some of these symptoms that pop up. You know, it could be like nausea or weight gain or weight loss, but they're saying, well, how does, you know, this person, you know, how do you sort of tease apart the symptoms, like these sort of, yeah, these symptoms of the body, but maybe it's the medical condition. And I guess, you know, all that said, I mean, do you think the medical community is recognizing this, you know, when they're trying to tease this apart? Yeah, how does, like, you know, they're experiencing these symptoms, and how do they go about, yeah, teasing them apart?
Wow, beautiful, beautiful raising of thoughts and questioning. The medical team is one of the supports in your journey through life. And sometimes the medical team is not just your doctor. So I would say use anyone and everyone in your healthcare team to help you cope with whatever symptoms you're feeling. Because not each individual in the team is going to recognize the symptoms one way or another. A doctor might recognize something and a nurse might recognize it as something else. I recently had someone who did have a cancer and had a very swollen tummy. And one doctor said to her, "You're just putting on weight." Until she herself thought, "This is not right, something's wrong with me." Until another doctor eventually she went to, and that other doctor said, "No, something's happening here, let's investigate." So none of us get it perfectly all of the time. So just be aware that it's worth, with whatever you're feeling, using a team approach. And if you're not happy with the explanation or the accounting for what symptoms you're feeling, keep searching from other people within your team. It may be the nurse, it may be your GP rather than your oncologist, it may be someone like a counsellor, it may be someone who is there to support you through pastoral care or through some spiritual guidance. So just recognize that you've got a whole team of people around you, and we all see things differently.
Okay.
Separating out what's physical, what's emotional, what's spiritual. You know, it's a tricky aspect, and no one of us is going to get it right all of the time.
Gotcha. Hey, thanks again. That's really good advice for our patient community. So, hey, I think we might just do the wrap up, if that's okay. Gotta say, it's been an absolute pleasure, Erica, having you on and talking into our webinar series. Yeah, I feel like you've given us lots of, lots of aspects of grief and loss, and given us a lot to think about and ponder. So, yeah, so from all of us at LBC and on behalf of our patient community that we support, a big thank you to you. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.